Good afternoon, or if you happen to be in the Central Mountain or Pacific time zones, good morning. Welcome to a special webinar, as you can see on the screen, Protecting Your Roots, Advanced Chemical and Cultural Solutions for Safeguarding Your Hard-Earned Growth. It's brought to you by Envu. It is presented by Golf Course Industry. I'm Golf Course Industry Managing Editor Matt Lowell. You won't hear too much from me today, especially after these first couple of minutes. You're not here to hear me. Instead, you'll hear plenty from Dr. Jesse Benelli and Dr. James Hempfling. They are both of Envu. They're going to dive into the factors influencing the development of root diseases in cool and warm season turfgrass and potential avenues for intervention. Disease control methods presented will encompass elements of integrated pest management, including various cultural and chemical approaches. Exciting results from recent university research trials will be shared, along with a surprising study conducted at a historic golf course in North Carolina. Take your guesses as to what that might be. Dr. Benelli covers the Southeast region for Envu. He is a Penn State grad. He earned his master's and doctorate from Tennessee. He served as the director of turfgrass pathology for the Chicago District Golf Association, where he provided agronomic consulting with more than 400 member clubs throughout that region before joining Envu. Dr. Hempfling covers the northern region for Envu. Before becoming a green solutions team specialist for the company, he worked as a solution development manager for turf and ornamental disease at Envu. He studied turfgrass management at Oklahoma State, go Cowboys, and earned his master's and doctorate at Rutgers. Let's jump in. Dr. Benelli, Dr. Hempfling, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Matt, for the introduction. Thank you, GCI, for hosting. My significant other asked me a couple days ago what I wanted to be for Halloween, and I simply said grateful, and that's what I am today, to be with you all to talk about protecting your roots, and I'm sure Jesse feels the same way. I will kick us off briefly reminding us all that the turfgrass and golf industries are key assets to the environment and to the economy. And so that'll lead into a discussion of how do we protect these assets. From an abiotic standpoint, how do we maximize our root mass ahead of stress? And then the bulk of the conversation will be managing root diseases. I'll cover cool season diseases, and Jesse will cover warm season diseases. So the reason I wanted to quickly touch on the benefits of turfgrass and golf is because we all find ourselves in positions where we need to be advocates for our industry. Many of us, it's just for friends and family or neighbors, but some of us advocate on a governmental level. And so first, I want to draw your attention to a recent publication. This just came out a couple weeks ago in the journal Crop Science. The article is titled "The Role of Turfgrasses in Environmental Protection and Their Benefits to Humans 30 Years Later." This was written by Dr. Ross Braun and co-authors. And it's a follow-up from a publication from 30 years earlier written by Dr. James Beard and co-author Green. Now, both of these articles are wonderful resources where the authors masterfully outline the benefits of living turfgrass systems, the benefits they apply to the environment, that they provide to society, and to the economy. And for example, some of you might not know that the turfgrass industry, when combined with the greater golf industry, together they contribute over $150 billion to the U.S. economy and combined over 2 million jobs. And one approach I like to take with friends and family and neighbors that might be skeptical about the role that turfgrass provides to society, I encourage them to open up Google Maps on their phone and go to a densely populated area like Los Angeles that you see on the screen, and you'll quickly see that golf courses are often the only green spaces in these dense urban sprawls. And so it's no wonder that humans and wildlife alike are attracted to these green sanctuaries. And so how do we protect these green sanctuaries that are also key business assets to those of us in the industry? Now, we're focusing on roots today, and we know that there are a range of abiotic and biotic factors that can stress our roots. I want to begin by addressing the abiotic component And I'll use cool season grasses as our example here. Many of you are familiar with this diagram depicting the growth potential of cool season turf throughout the entire year, with greater root and shoot growth in the spring and the fall months, with a decline in root and shoot growth in midsummer. And that's because there's less energy available to the plants due to heat stress. The demand for energy is greater than the supply. And there are many studies showing this correlation, specifically with heat stress being the most important factor, and a clear correlation with air and soil temperatures increasing and root biomass decreasing. See big dips in root biomass as you get into the heat of midsummer. So quickly, I want to suggest a few cultural management practices that we could consider to grow as many roots as possible ahead of summer stress. Think of it as a war of attrition, and you want to go into battle with as many troops, as many roots as possible, so that your chances of making it through successfully are as high as possible. So first consideration, increasing mowing height. There's some really nice studies from the early 2000s showing that increasing mowing height by 0.03 of an inch, 0.03 inches, can increase photosynthesis by 40% and increase root biomass by 25%. Now, you don't have to make that full increase from 100 to 130 mowing height to receive those benefits. You can get incremental benefits by maybe just increasing it by 100, by 0.01. And so if you have to make some adjustments to your management program to adjust for maybe decreasing green speeds from increasing mowing height, consider employing lightweight rolling or double cutting to satisfy your golfer expectations. Additionally, there have been huge advances by our talented turfgrass breeders to have cultivars and cool season grasses that are better able to tolerate heat stress, for example, or warm season grasses that can better tolerate biotic stresses, something to consider during regrassing or overseeding. Judicious irrigation, not too much, not too little. I'm a huge fan of evapotranspiration-based irrigation scheduling, coupling that with handheld TDR meters, buried soil sensors that will help make our roots as bountiful as possible. Same concept with proper fertilization, not too much, not too little. Adhering to MSLN, for example, is a good approach. Compaction stresses and excessive organic matter. These are two things that can greatly compromise our roots, and as a result, using cultivation is a good approach to mitigate those stresses. Hollow tine aeration, for example, is a good practice, especially when paired with something like sand top dressing to provide a better medium for our roots to grow in. And lastly, this is not a comprehensive list, and I don't have time to give it justice, but one more consideration is removing shade stress and improving air movement by selectively removing trees, root pruning, incorporating fans. All these will increase photosynthesis and as a result, increase root biomass. Now, the inconvenient truth here is that you might be the world-leading expert in growing roots. You might have the greatest root biomass of anyone, but there will always be the biotic component. There will always be these pathogens that are lurking below the surface that want to do nothing more than to harm your roots. And so I'm going to hand it over now to Jesse to introduce root diseases.
Yeah, well said. And the reality is for many of these root diseases, even the best performing fungicides need the help with proper BMPs. Because if you're not doing some of the things you've just outlined, you're already behind the eight ball, and that's somewhere you don't want to be. And as we begin to talk more in depth on root diseases, I'd like to introduce a quote by Dr. Jim Kearns and Lee Butler, who run the NC State Diagnostic Lab. So they've said of the 10,000 plus samples we receive, 68% of the diseases diagnosed on greens are root diseases. So simply put, with these diagnosticians, they're spending the majority of their time diagnosing root diseases. So you, as the golf course superintendent, should take a step back and think maybe I should give root diseases more of my attention when I start to build a comprehensive fungicide program. What I see too often is I think sometimes on greens, too many people worry about something like this. So what are we looking at here? We are looking at dollar spot on a creep and bent grass putting green. Okay. As a turf pathologist, dollar spot on greens does not scare me in the least for a couple of different reasons. Number one, dollar spot on greens is pretty easily controlled. If you pull up the Vincelli document or the chemical control of turfgrass diseases, just updated in 2024, you can look at the sheer number of products that provide 3 or more star control of dollar spot. I believe it's over 40. But the important part in that is that spans over 6 or 7 different modes of action that are providing excellent control. Now, dollar spot on fairways is an entirely different conversation. There's resistance concerns, DMIs, SDHIs, and we're talking fairways. So now we're talking acreage and expenses. But on greens, this disease really doesn't scare me. So I'll go back a slide. So one of the reasons why dollar spot doesn't scare me is what we're seeing on this screen. And you may think, Jesse, what the heck are you talking about? I'm looking at dollar spot and the mycelium just ripping apart turfgrass. Exactly, that's what you see, and that's an advantage we have in managing these foliar diseases that we don't have with root diseases. For many of these foliar diseases, especially dollar spot, what we can see is basic plant pathology 101, signs and symptoms. So what does that mean? The signs is when you can visibly lay eyes on the pathogen or fungal body. And the dollar spot pathogen provides us that with that fluffy white aerial mycelium that we could see. Plus, the image on the bottom right side of the screen is called a symptom, which is the plant's response to infection. So the plant is telling us, hey, I'm infected, I'm producing this lesion, and with dollar spot, it's that characteristic hourglass-shaped lesion. So you can see it when it's active. That is something we don't have the luxury with many of these root diseases. A classic example would be spring dead spot. And so spring dead spot is active in the fall, but you may not see the symptoms until several months later in the spring as turf begins to green up. So you really can't see when spring dead spot is active. You just have to really pay attention to soil temperatures, understand the biology of this disease, and you can't be late. So if you were to see these symptoms in the spring, tremendous amounts of damage, there is diminishing returns of applying any fungicide right now, because fungicides work best when the pathogen is active. In the case of spring dead spot, by the time you're seeing symptoms, it's no longer active. Another difficulty is the fact that we have this latency period in terms of infection to symptom expression. A cool season example is take-all patch, where this pathogen that causes take-all patch is active in the fall and then in the spring, but yet you won't see symptoms until late spring, early summer, when you get that first drought or heat stress. And as bad as it looks on the surface, I can assure you that the situation is much more dire below the ground, where now our roots are completely dysfunct. And then here's an unfortunate reality. If this has happened to you, you didn't make the applications in time, you're seeing take-all patch symptoms on the surface, pathogen is no longer active, there's nothing more you can do. But the reality is now you're entering the most stressful time of the year, the summer months, with roots that no longer work that well. So in summary, root diseases are very challenging for a number of reasons, very difficult to diagnose, not just in the field when you're standing on the turf, but also back in the lab. And it's difficult for those diagnosticians because oftentimes, and we'll talk about this later in the presentation, that they'll see several pathogens at once and they will often form what's called a disease complex. And James mentioned all those BMPs, and folks, those are needed. Complete control, just relying on fungicides is very, very difficult. So now I'm going to hand over the baton to James to offer some cool season perspectives.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. And just to reiterate that point, when it comes to cool season diseases, they start showing their ugly faces in the heat of midsummer in terms of symptoms at the surface, meaning that those pathogens were likely active weeks, if not months, before the appearance of symptoms at the surface. So it makes sense that when it comes to timing fungicide applications, those would be in the earlier summer, late spring months, April and May, for example. And specifically, fungicide applications targeting root diseases are triggered by soil temperatures. So for example, fairy ring and take-all patch are triggered by a springtime soil temperature at a 2-inch depth of 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, about a month later, weeks later, that's typically when we see a soil temperature of 65 degrees Fahrenheit, which would trigger applications for summer patch and Pythium root rot, for example. And it's during this time frame, too, that you might want to target root knot nematodes, which may be present at your site. And if so, we're talking about at least 3 different modes of action would be likely needed to control these fungal organisms, this Pythium, this oomycete organism, and nematodes. And that can be a challenge. And it gives me an opportunity to briefly introduce a new product called Resilia that truly is a first of its kind, and that it can target these fungal, Pythium, and nematode pathogens. It's only labeled for root diseases, and it controls all of these major soil-borne pathogens for up to 28 days, allowing your roots to reach their full potential and allowing you to protect all that hard-earned growth that you've worked so hard for by employing those BMPs. Now, the success of Resilia is attributed to the optimized combination of 3 active ingredients: prothioconazole to target fungal diseases, propamacarb hydrochloride to target Pythium diseases, and fluopyram to target harmful nematodes. Now, we'll talk more about Resilia and many other chemical products to control these root diseases in subsequent slides. And what I want to do is I'll take you through one by one some of these most important cool season root diseases, starting with take-all patch. You see the symptoms here on the screen on creeping bentgrass turf. It is a fungal disease, and it is primarily found on creeping bentgrass. It's caused by the fungus Graminomyces graminis. It has kind of a narrow range of conditions that are conducive for this disease. It's more aggressive on alkaline soils above a pH of 6, typically found on newly renovated or newly sodded greens, especially after a lime application, and then high moisture and cool to mild soil temperatures will be conducive for take-all patch. And one critical best management practice for take-all patch is to apply manganese, the micronutrient manganese. And this dates back to research coming from Rutgers in the mid-90s, where the researchers found that applications of manganese in the spring at rates of 2 pounds of elemental manganese per acre could reduce take-all patch severity by up to 70%. Now, to achieve a rate of 2 pounds elemental manganese per acre, you would be applying a product like manganese sulfate at a rate of 5.5 to 6.25 pounds per acre, depending on the percent manganese content in that product. So you'd want to make those manganese applications in the spring and the fall around the same time that you would be making your fungicide applications targeting take-all patch. Now, on this screen, I'm showing average 10-year soil temperatures from a location in the middle of the country, because we probably have attendees from all across the US here. So Columbia, Missouri. And in Columbia, we reach 55 degrees Fahrenheit sometime in April, typically. And that's when we would have our first application targeting take-all patch and fairy ring. Now, if you're only targeting take-all patch, the research actually shows that fall applications will be more efficacious. And those will be triggered whenever soil temperatures at a 2-inch depth go under 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and that window goes between 60 degrees and 45 degrees Fahrenheit, sometime in late September to early November. And here you'll make 1 or 2 fungicide applications, depending on the history of the site and the severity of disease symptoms. Historically, might even require that spring application as well to get complete control of take-all patch. And I want to emphasize that whenever you select a product that is very effective at reducing a soil-borne disease like take-all patch, not only are you minimizing those symptoms at the surface, but what you're doing is you're protecting the roots. Again, protecting that root biomass that you've worked so hard to grow. Here are these Resilient treated plots having longer roots than the untreated just because they've protected them from this harmful disease. And here's what it looks like at the surface, cores from Resilient treated plots compared to the untreated. And moving on to another fungal disease, summer patch. This disease is particularly severe on annual bluegrass, Kentucky bluegrass, and fine fescues, although it's becoming an increasing problem on creeping bentgrass as well, especially in the southeast U.S. Now, it's caused by the fungus Magnaphorthiopsis poiei, and it becomes active at soil temperatures around 65 degrees Fahrenheit. And the symptoms only become more and more severe as temperatures increase throughout the summer months. And this picture in the bottom right just shows ectotrophic runner hyphae, which are responsible for causing your roots to not function correctly and ultimately leading them to not be able to take up water and nutrients, ultimately causing these symptoms above ground. Now, here we're obviously entering into the hardcore turf pathology section of the presentation, so I would be remiss to not show the disease triangle, but I want to use summer patch as an opportunity to show how we can manipulate the 3 corners of the disease triangle to reduce summer patch symptoms. Now, starting with the host. If you're in a position where you're overseeding or renovating, please consider doing the research to find out which cultivars of Kentucky bluegrass, for example, have reduced susceptibility to summer patch disease. If you have Kentucky bluegrass roughs and you have summer patch issues there, maybe consider introducing tall fescue, for example. Reducing shade to enhance photosynthesis, another way to help the host defend itself to increase biomass. Now entering into the realm of the environment, improving drainage and reducing compaction. And the research shows that compaction is a very influential factor when it comes to summer patch disease severity. And this is coming from recent research from the University of Connecticut. Dr. John Inguaggiato had a really nice study examining the effects of compaction combined with practices to remove compaction, cultivation practices like solid tining and hollow tining, and then manganese as well. And what this research showed is that 1, compaction is very impactful on this disease. 2, manganese is also very impactful. In fact, whenever you apply manganese, it completely washes out any differences you would see in these cultivation practices to remove compaction. But in conditions of no manganese and compaction, it does show that yes, hollow tining is an effective practice to remove compaction and reduce summer patch symptoms. Solid tining didn't help in this case. In fact, it slightly increased summer patch symptoms. But to quickly summarize this, if you have compacted soils, use hollow tine cultivation to remove that stress, and also consider having variable depth tines to remove the risk of creating a plow pan layer, which is what happened with the solid tining. Secondly, manganese, similar to take-all patch, manganese is an effective BMP for reducing summer patch severity. Try to apply a total of 6 pounds manganese per acre in the spring, and you might consider making split applications, again, at that 2-pound manganese per acre rate, or in terms of manganese sulfate product rates, that's about 5.5 to 6.25 pounds manganese sulfate per acre. Now, a picture says 1,000 words. This is going back to the concept of increasing mowing heights to maximize photosynthesis and maximize root biomass. This is Kentucky bluegrass maintained at an intermediate rough height of cut and a rough height of cut. Same cultivar. And it's safe to assume that the summer patch pathogen has colonized both heights of cut equally in the roots, But the rough height turf had larger root biomass and was able to withstand that colonization from the pathogen better, and as a result be less susceptible to manifesting visible symptoms compared to this lower mowing height. So we can add increasing mowing heights to this list of BMPs. And lastly, pH is another important consideration for summer patch. Similar to take-all patch, you want to keep your pH at 6.8 or lower for summer patch. Consider using acidifying fertilizer sources like ammonium sulfate to make sure you don't increase your pH over time. So as a result of employing these BMPs, we're affecting these corners of the disease triangle. When we want to affect the pathogen, that's where fungicides come into play. And again, the timing for your first summer patch application is going to be typically about a month after your first fairy ring application. Usually in the month of May is when you'll get soil temperatures around 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, a good rule of thumb is that it's probably going to require more than one application to get complete control of summer patch. 3 applications is a common recommendation, and that goes for fairy ring as well. The summer patch applications, if you're applying a DMI or a QOI, you'll likely have an effect on fairy ring as well while you're targeting summer patch. If you're at a site with a history of very severe summer patch symptoms, this goes for fairy ring too. You might have to have tighter application intervals, not 28 days, but maybe 21, in some severe cases, maybe even 14-day intervals. And you might have to make applications stretching into July and August as well. Again, it's very dependent on the history of the site and all those other factors we've mentioned previously. But I want to reiterate this point that if you select a product that provides excellent control of a disease like summer patch, you're not only reducing visible symptoms above ground, but really what you're doing is you're protecting those roots that you've worked so hard to grow compared to turf that's not treated. The last disease that I'll discuss during the cool season section here is Pythium root rot. And this can be a very challenging disease to control for at least 2 main reasons. The first reason is that symptoms of Pythium root rot can be caused by many different Pythium species. And from one species to another, they may have varying temperature optima, meaning that some Pythium species might be active in cool temperatures and others might cause Pythium root rot symptoms in warm temperatures. And that means that you could be fighting this disease during a large stretch of the year, if not during almost the whole year in some climates. The second part of the difficulty of controlling Pythium root rot is the soil conditions, and really it's saturated soil conditions that drive Pythium root rot. So the top 3 practices or cultural practices to reduce Pythium root rot severity: drainage, drainage, and drainage. So surface drainage projects, subsurface drainage projects, cultivation, sand top dressing, anything to get that water to move through the profile better, more rapidly. Now, here's another inconvenient truth. Applying a fungicide is easy, and something like fixing drainage issues is not easy. And as Jesse mentioned previously, I hope we drive this point home during our presentation today. Underlying soil issues must be addressed for fungicides to have any chance to provide acceptable level of control against not only Pythium root rot, but any of these root diseases. Something I say, I feel like a broken record saying this all the time, but your chemical program is only as strong as the weakest link in your cultural management program. So in terms of fungicide applications for Pythium root rot, those are going to be potentially applied during a large stretch of the summer. And again, emphasizing that at any given moment, you'll be targeting not only fungal pathogens, but oomycete pathogens. And if you have nematodes present at your site, you'll be targeting those too, potentially at the same time. Further emphasizing why Resilia might be a product that you may be interested in trying if you're managing cool season turf. But Resilia, just like any other fungicide, is best used as a part of a whole fungicide program. And I want to highlight a research trial from last year where we wanted to include Resilia in a fungicide program along with other Envu fungicides. And we wanted to test this program in a very trying climate. So it's creeping bentgrass putting green turf in North Carolina. So this gave us the opportunity to work with Dr. Jim Kearns. And we presented Jim with this program, and he said, yes, he'd love to test it. And he would also like to test a program of his own creation, an NC State fungicide program. And both of these programs applied fungicides on a weekly basis. Just to quickly walk you through the Envu program, we had foliar applications on a biweekly basis. The foliar program included Signature Extra applied with Daconil Ultrex or with Interface Stress Guard. And then on the other weeks, we applied a root disease program, which was Resilia alternated with Serrata and Mirage. Now, these root applications were watered in. The NC State program was very similar. Both programs applied Signature Extra with a contact fungicide every 14 days. And then both programs applied a root fungicide application on their alternate weeks. They both included 3 applications of Serrata. Now, the key difference here is that the backbone of the root health program for the Envu plots included Resilia applied 4 times, whereas the root fungicide program for NC State was founded in Lexicon. Now, applications began in May, and by the end of June, symptoms were already firing off pretty strong in the non-treated control plots, Pythium root rot, and some foliar disease activity here. The Envu treatments highlighted in white, holding up very well. And the NC State program also doing very well in terms of controlling disease and providing good turf quality and turf color. By July, you see the non-treated controls are getting hammered pretty well with Pythium root rot and foliar diseases, and the Envu program holding up very well, and the NC State program not far behind. And by August, we're almost seeing bare ground in the non-treated controls. And this is where it's really impressive that these fungicide programs are holding up very well. Again, Envu treatments in white. NC State not far behind, but maybe not quite as good color and quality as Envu program. And that's what the data shows, is that Envu program slightly edged out the NC State program, but they both provided excellent control of Pythium root rot. Now, one reason I really wanted to share this trial is what happened after treatments had ended. And if you're a researcher, you know that likely you probably need to use this putting green again next season. And that might be an issue to get this green recovered and in usable condition by next spring. So that means that you got to go into recovery mode in September and October. So that involved a couple aeration events in September and October. And what happened is that Jim noticed, he made an interesting observation, and he reached out to us and he said, hey, I think there's something you might be interested in here. I'm noticing that the Envu program is recovering from aeration more rapidly compared to the other fungicide programs. And while we don't know the exact explanation here, it's logical to assume that the Envu program protected those roots better, had larger root biomass maintained throughout the entire season, and thus more energy available for recovery when it came to September and October. Now, there were also a low level of nematodes in this green too, and that was also likely part of this conversation. So with that, I'm going to wrap up my section, and I'll also have a teaser saying that this isn't the only time that we've seen lingering treatment effects from Resilia treatments in replicated trials.
Yeah, thanks, James. And one of the things I'd like to say is, some of you in attendance are likely looking at the clock right now, thinking, I think we're going to get done a little early. There's about 25 minutes left. I mean, what is there really to talk about with worm season greens? And the reality is, breaking news, Bermuda grass gets disease too. And what I find mildly amusing is the difference between when creeping bent grass putting greens have major issues versus when ultra-dwarf Bermuda grass putting greens have major issues. So with creep and bent grass putting greens, for reasons James has already said, is that you can pretty much forecast each year when things are going to hit the fan and things are getting a little bit hairy, right? We know if you're growing bent grass putting greens or POA greens, that by the time we hit June, July, and August, it's going to be all hands on deck, right? As a golf course superintendent, you likely are not taking the family on a 2-week vacation to Dollywood in East Tennessee in the middle of July. Likely not happening. But here's Bermuda grass. See, the big difference is you don't always have that singular spike or time of the year when things are going to be very problematic. We just don't see that. And when you're building a fungicide program and you're looking at this, that problems can arise nearly any month of the year managing Bermuda grass putting greens, is that there really is a need to develop a fungicide program where you're having a lot of different considerations for root disease protection in the spring, summer, and fall. And in the spring, the first disease that comes to mind is fairy ring. As a quick recap, there are 3 types of fairy ring that we see in turf. Type 3 is the fun one. Type 3 fairy ring is when you're going to see mushroom bodies arranged in a circular fashion. Most of the time, that is not damaging whatsoever. Okay, type 2 fairy ring is what we're seeing on this screen right now. So type 2 fairy ring is when you have green patches or rings of turf. Why this is happening is that fungus, which doesn't actually infect the turf, but in a way kind of infects that soil profile because it's munching on some of that organic matter, thus the release of some nitrogen, which is causing some of this greening response. Now, some people think that, type 2 fairy ring is just cosmetic. I can just let it go. What's the big deal? The big deal is that type 2 fairy ring can kind of graduate up to type 1 fairy ring, which is when we start to see those necrotic bands and loss of turf on the margins of those expanding patches. And I will say it is much more easily controlled if you're attacking fairy ring at this stage versus this. Type 1 fairy ring, Bermuda grass putting greens in Florida. Now you have a tremendous uphill battle in terms of getting this off your course because there's a lot of problems you got to deal with, both equally important. One is that hydrophobic layer. That fungus has really dug its heels in. I can bet anything, all of this area through here is hydrophobic, so it's not accepting much water whatsoever. Number 2, you likely didn't go preventative. So now there's a lot of that fungal inoculum in the soil that you have to manage as well. And above all of this, you essentially have a grow-in operation because now you need to get that Bermuda grass to fill in those voids. One of the messages here that we've already reiterated several times is you really have to go preventative to stay ahead of these things. For most of the country, if you're going preventative, initiate those fungicide applications when soil temperatures hit 55 degrees for a few straight days in the upper 2 inches of the soil profile. Now I'm going to call a brief timeout to say, for those in more tropical locations, Florida, southern Texas, the deep south, that's when you want to hold back and make your first applications when soil temperatures start climbing above 65 degrees. And curative control is a long process. Hopefully, we're not doing much of that. But what is the 911 program? You got a fire to put out. You got a lot of fairy ring symptoms present. What are the steps? And I pulled these from Dr. Mike Fidanza, a fairy ring expert, faculty member at Penn State University. And he essentially recommends combination of cultural and chemical practices. Step 1, make some type of cultivation to the turf, whether you're aerifying or needle tying. What we want to do is improve drainage any way we can. Improve drainage on the surface, improve water movement down below with subsurface drainage. Okay, fairy ring really loves these wet-dry cycles. So if it's dry for an extended time, then it gets wet for an extended time. That makes mushrooms go crazy. You want more consistent moisture management in the root zone, and improving drainage can help you do that. It gives you more control. The second thing I like about aerifying or even needle tining, when you're doing that, you're essentially creating that channel from the surface down into the root zone. Okay, that is as close as it gets to having a paved highway for your fungicide or wetting agent applications. Whenever you're punching holes, there's a great opportunity to apply something and have a better chance of getting that into the root system. So step one, aerify or needle tine the affected areas. Step two, apply wetting agents and fungicides. The wetting agent to help rectify the soil hydrophobicity, and the fungicide to knock down that fungal inoculum. Wetting agents really help your fungicides out, especially if your fairy ring is located deeper in that soil profile. Okay, lastly, water these fungicides and wetting agents in immediately. Fungicides are not like herbicides. You know, with many herbicides, you can irrigate 7 days from now and be okay. Fungicides are very sticky. The best recommendation is once you're done spraying that green, turn on the heads immediately. I know for some of you it's a pain with outdated hydraulic systems, but you've got to find a way to put water on top of that fungicide. And so the question I often get is, okay, Jesse, I'm going to follow your fairy ring program. How many minutes of irrigation do I put down if I'm going at X, Y, or Z root disease? The reality is I don't know your irrigation system. I don't know the coverage it provides. You know, I can tell you if we're talking my own home lawn, that in this particular spot, it's going to take me 38 minutes of running this particular set of irrigation to put down a 1/2 inch of irrigation after my fungicide application. Okay, so you have to figure that out, conduct an audit, find a way of knowing how much water am I putting down and how many minutes that will take. And that may vary by grain, believe it or not. The other thing I would like to point out is with most root diseases, a typical recommendation is 1/10 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch of irrigation. That's going to cover you for a lot of things like mini ring, take all patch, take all root rot, Pythium root rot. The time when it becomes different is with fairy ring. It's when it becomes a more dynamic conversation, because what you'd have to do is figure out where in that soil profile the problem areas are. Where is that fungal mass, which you can figure out by incubating a soil profile overnight and see if you can see where those mushrooms are popping up. And then do a water droplet test to figure out where your issues are at from a hydrophobic perspective. Once you know that, then you have a lot of really good information in terms of how much irrigation you need to apply after that application. So with fairy ring, you're going to have to make at least 3 applications to Bermuda grass putting greens to get season-long control, beginning when soil temperatures hit 55 degrees. The reality is, for a lot of places, you're going to need more applications than that, potentially up to 5. So in this case, monthly applications beginning in March, going through July. Now, for some of you who may not have the budget to make 5 premier fairy ring applications each season, what I would encourage you to do, and this is advice for many root diseases, not just fairy ring, is that if you're struggling with root diseases, try to find a way where you could repurpose or reprioritize your fungicide applications. Okay, so here's a scenario. It's July. You know, typically you can see a little bit of bipolaris leaf spot on the surface. If you spray a fungicide, a broad spectrum fungicide, leave it on the surface for a leaf spot control, then you're going to have excellent leaf spot control. Makes sense. But think about how fungicides move. They tend to go from the base of the plant up to new growing points, right? Most of these are xylem systemic. If you leave it on the surface, you're likely not going to get any fairy ring control. Conversely, one of the things that I recommend is when you're using broad spectrum fungicides, water these in for fairy ring, then you're going to get fairy ring control. And in this data by Dr. Joe Roberts at Clemson, when you use things like tartan alternated by Densicor, we watered these in for fairy ring, and in typical fashion, fairy ring did not show up in this fairy ring trial, but ink spot did. And we provided complete control of ink spot, even though these fungicides were watered in for fairy ring. Dr. Lee Miller, who's now at Purdue, saw very similar things in earlier work on take-all patch. Watering in those DMIs, he saw downstream effects of dollar spot control. Okay, so fairy ring is something to consider in the spring. And then that hands the baton off to mini ring, which can be very active in the summer months. So mini ring, it's a relatively new disease. This started popping up all over right after 2010, when many people converted their bent grass greens to Bermuda grass after some very problematic summers. So mini ring, the pathogen that causes it, is most active when soil temperatures are between 77 and 95 degrees. So it's active right in the middle of the summer, but you may not see the symptoms until there's stress, where symptoms are usually delayed from late summer into early fall. Okay, damage is often associated with turf irrigated with clean water and turf fertilized with ammonium sulfate. Okay, and it's not just minimal impacts in terms of which nitrogen source you use. It's a major influence on mini ring severity. This was outstanding work by Luke Dant when he was doing his Ph.D. at Clemson. And what we're looking at here is comparing ammonium sulfate applications to urea applications. Both of these fertilizers were applied at a rate of 1/10 of a pound of N weekly, and we see drastic differences. So if you're struggling with mini ring and fungicides alone are not doing it as well as you would like, take a very, very close look at your fertilization program, because it does matter. So one of the interesting things about mini ring, and they do all this amazing work to figure out at what temperatures does it grow optimally. And at Envu, what we tend to do almost every year is we are constantly updating our fungicide recommendations. So when you actually take the time to plot out your soil temperatures, which this is taken from Atlanta, Georgia, 10-year average, when you plot those out, you realize that a place like Atlanta, Georgia, the time when mini ring is highly active is essentially from mid-May through the first part of October. That's 140 days. So where typically we may have recommended, make 2 applications, 3 applications a year, if this pathogen is active for 140 days, it's going to take many more applications than that. And now, conversely, if you're a superintendent in Naples, Florida, pull up your soil temperatures. You're going to be near 80 from March through November. So this, for people in tropical locations, is a year-round disease. So most of the time, you're going to have to make 5 applications applied monthly for adequate mini ring control. What we don't want to happen is there's no applications made. Then in mid-October, you finish blowing off these putting greens and you're seeing mini ring symptoms. Applying a fungicide at this time, again, will not do a whole lot of good. The pathogen is no longer active. So when I see fungicides applied at that time for mini ring, I call that the angry killing approach. That doesn't do anything. That's when your team lost and then you throw the remote. So in terms of fungicide selection, what we've learned both in the field and in some in vitro work is that the most consistent control for mini ring is the DMI chemistries. QOIs can be inconsistent, SDHIs are inconsistent, but DMIs are typically the ones that perform the best. And even some DMIs that in vitro work outstanding, mini-ring is one of those fungicides that can really humble even the best performing chemistries in the market. Now, this research was done before the release of prothioconazole, which is the active ingredient in Densicor and Resilia. And what we found with mini-ring, and research by Jim Kearns, is that Densicor provides lights out mini-ring control. It's the only fungicide he ranks a full 4 stars for mini-ring as well as fairy-ring. Now, please note the applications in this slide. He initiated applications in July, but symptoms were delayed until October. So mapping out when mini-ring is active, you got fairy-ring is active, and then fairy-ring and mini-ring. And then when you're in midsummer, mini-ring is one of the major concerns. We talk about spring and summer. Now what to think about in the fall. In the fall, the disease that comes to my mind is take-all root rot. What we know about take-all root rot now, that it is caused by at least 5 different pathogens. Each will produce this darkened ectotrophic runner hyphae. And so with 5 pathogens, they did the work to figure out what their optimal temperature range is. And what they found is that these pathogens that cause take-all root rot are active at warmer temperatures than we previously thought. If you look at some of the recommendations 10 years ago, people were saying apply fungicides for take-all root rot in the shoulder seasons. The reality is these things are active in the months of July and August. So they're active when soil temperatures are warm, but symptoms may not develop until there's a stress in late summer, early fall. And one of the things to consider is that with all those different pathogens, they actually differ in fungicide sensitivity. Some are more sensitive to DMIs, some are more sensitive to QOIs, which is why our recommendations usually begin with tartan stress guard. We like tartan alternated by Resilia for take-all root rot control. So for more comprehensive control, what are some of the things we can do to reduce disease severity? Is reduce plant stress, raise mowing, increase sunlight, pruning trees, and incorporate signature stress guard. That helps. I often joke that the best fungicide out there is a tank mixture of sunlight and air movement, and the second best is often signature stress guard. And we've seen that in the research. You apply QOIs and DMIs watered in for take-all root rot, and have a signature and Daconil program on the surface, you get better control, likely because the plant is less stressed. And the recommendations for fungicide timing is once you're monitoring these soil temperatures and you're starting to see the soil temperatures begin their slow descent in late summer, that's when you pull the trigger and apply them at 21-day intervals and make sure you water them in immediately. Okay. So in the spring, we're worried about fairy ring. In the summer, mini ring, and then obviously take-all root rot in the fall. The reality is that in the fall, there's a number of other pathogens that are starting to affect Bermuda grass. And it is the fall when Bermuda grasses are most sensitive. That's because temperatures are dropping, the duration of sunlight is shortening. Bermuda grass is very, very vulnerable. And what we know now is you look at all of these different pathogens, whether the take-all fungus, spring dead spot, Pythium species, and nematodes, we know that there is that interaction, that they're all kind of working together, making problems worse for the golf course superintendent. And several researchers have noted the interaction of soil-borne pathogens. Here's a tweet by Dr. Maria Tommaso Peterson's lab, fitting that it was tweeted in mid-September 2019, because that's right when that transition period happens. So essentially, they got a plug sent to their diagnostic lab that they found roots with high levels of nematodes, they found evidence of the take-all root rot fungus and Pythium in the same fungus. So oospores and Pythium, nematodes, and ectotrophic runner hyphae. Odds are they're working together and they can make problems worse. Okay, this is also highlighted by work from Dr. Billy Crow's lab in 2017. So he set up a trial in a controlled greenhouse environment with Bermuda grass, and they wanted to look at the percentage of roots infected with Pythium. And they had a couple of different inoculation treatments. When they did not inoculate anything, well, they didn't see any Pythium in the roots. Makes sense. When they inoculated the plants with just sting nematodes, again, no Pythium present. And here's a shocker. When they inoculated with Pythium, they saw some Pythium. The take-home message is this, and what's surprising is when they co-inoculated those plots or Bermuda grass pots with both sting and Pythium, the amount of Pythium in those roots more than doubled. So it's important to shut down that pathogen interaction. And then as we move forward and look at Bermuda grass putting green management and understand when is the best time to make fungicide applications, and you're thinking about how to build your own program, I mentioned there's things to consider in every season. One of the things that I like about Resilia is that there is a fit in the spring in your farrowing program. There's a fit midsummer when mini ring and farrowing is active. But the recommendation that I like the best is when you include Resilia in your fall management program. This is when Resilia is going to check off so many different boxes for you, whether it's take-all, Pythium root rot, or nematodes, and especially something like spring dead spot, where we have seen phenomenal results with Resilia. And you can see with this trial conducted at NC State, Dr. Kearns knows how to farm one heck of a population of spring dead spot. That is almost an unrealistic load of spring dead spot. And the reality is Densicor performed very, very well against that disease. I'm pretty proud of how it did, granted how much pressure. But look at the difference Resilia made in this trial. Now with Resilia, when we're talking spring dead spot control, it is the prothioconazole portion or the Densicor component that's doing the heavy lifting. But as we see here, we can obviously tell something else is at play. There's likely Pythium root rot in those soils, and then there's also likely some nematodes. And as James mentioned in some previous research where they found some delayed effects of Resilia applications, and accidentally, we found the exact same thing happen on Bermuda grass putting greens. So this was 2 summers ago in the summer of 2023 at Pinehurst No. 2, we used one of their practice greens. We made 4 applications of Resilia between May and July of 2023. Throughout the entire trial period, and we watered these in, we never once saw any difference in any counts, any disease severity, or any measurements of turf quality. Everything looked the same. And at that point, the trial was terminated. We forgot all about it until they hosted a pretty big tournament the next year, and our own Cameron Smith was volunteering at Pinehurst, helping those boys out. He's in line at a concession stand, and lo and behold, he could see remnants of our trial first appear over a year after the last application, which was really stunning to see. And I think this is Cameron Smith right here kind of shaking his head, wondering, is this really where we had the trial? And it was. And again, I know a lot of the times we put down these applications and we want to see results within 24 to 72 hours. But sometimes it takes longer to see those results. In the case of Pinehurst No. 2, all of that stress, they put a concession stand right next to the trial, all of that foot traffic, that's when we saw all these differences. So applying now can pay dividends much, much later downstream. So some concluding remarks. Please understand that infection can occur weeks to months before you see visible symptoms. A lot of the times we'll get a phone call where, hey, I sprayed this fungicide on Monday and mini ring popped up on Tuesday. That disease was likely active weeks or even months before. So infection can occur weeks to months before symptoms are present. An accurate diagnosis is critical. Root diseases represent a very diverse group of pathogens, from fungus pathogens to oomycetes or nematodes. And I recognize Resilia does kind of provide an easy button for that, but make sure you have an accurate diagnosis before applying your fungicide. As James mentioned several times, combine cultural practices with a strong fungicide program. And take opportunities to get two birds with one stone. You can, with proper product selection, attack multiple diseases at once. So take advantage of that. And last but not least, please water in these fungicides as soon as possible. It's your job to play matchmaker. Put those fungicides at the site of infection is going to increase your odds of success. So with that, we'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, so we are at the top of the hour. If you guys want to hang on and answer a couple, we've got a few. First off, I have to say that the photos that Cameron took, that is absolutely wild, especially with the concession stand right next to it. Amazing. Have a couple in the queue. If you have not turned in a question and you want to ask Jesse or James a question, get it into the Q&A chat here. We're going to start with one from Sean. Might need some more detail on this, but Sean asks, can you run at a higher carrier? I use a 4 GPA for soil sprays.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, sure. And hi, Sean. I know Sean. Here's my answer. A higher carrier volume will be better than a low carrier volume, but it probably won't get the fungicide where it needs to go. Of course, this depends on what disease you're targeting. But if you are targeting fairy ring, for example, or even summer patch, tickle patch, any of those, you're going to still need to apply post-application irrigation to get that fungicide to the target zone. It's very rare, if not impossible, to get that material where it needs to go just by higher carrier volumes.
One more in the queue right now. Again, if you're still here, you have a question, type that in. If we get it here in the next few seconds, we can get to it on this webinar. William asks, what depth for temperature monitoring? What depth do you use for accurate temp monitoring?
Most of the time we're looking at that upper 2 inches, because that's where most of our roots are, and that's where a lot of that pathogen activity is. So top 2 inches is when we want to, 2 inches deep is when we want to monitor those soil temperatures.
Pretty easy, 2 inches. It's basically not even a thumb. That's great. Just got a new one. Nick asks, what do you think about 3 applications in the fall for spring dead spot control compared to just 2 applications?
Yeah, well, the easy answer is the more you apply, the better chance of success that you will have. You know, the big thing with spring dead spot chemistries is making sure all of your fungicide applications matter and count. What you want to do is apply those fungicides when the grass is still actively growing. Worst case scenario is you apply your first spring dead spot fungicide when soil temperatures hit 70, and you decide you're going to stick to a very strict 28-day interval, and then you wait 28 days. If there's been a hard frost, that grass is no longer growing that well, and the plant won't really be able to absorb that much fungicide. So shortening the intervals or using 3 applications for spring dead spot is going to increase the likelihood you're going to get complete control.
Makes sense. We have another James, not Dr. James Hempfling, checking in with a question. The use of zoysia grass, he asks, Rollmaster, Lynxmaster? I don't know if do you know what he's going for there?
maybe potential watchouts for root diseases for zoysia, or if regrassing to that species will provide benefits compared to maybe having Bermuda grass at the site. This is a warm season question, so I will let Jesse answer first.
Yeah, here's what we've learned. No matter what you're putting down, all these new different turf species and finding new utility, the pathogens and diseases will come. We've already seen with zoysia grass putting greens that they can get spring dead spot, which we think of as a Bermuda grass disease. They can get many of the same leaf spots. Zoysia grasses are definitely not immune to disease. In fact, it's almost more challenging because we know less about it, and there's probably more surprises ahead with zoysia grass, and I know there will be.
And with cool season grasses too, we know that from great work that's going on at Rutgers and other places.
Keith asks, does Bermuda dormancy factor into control of these diseases?
Yes, and to reiterate one of the questions that was just asked a little bit ago, for something like spring dead spot, you really want to make sure that that plant is not fully dormant. So you can water in a fungicide, get some of that into the root system, which is very important for some of our systemic chemistries. Most of the time, applying fungicides to dormant turf, dormant warm season turf, there are some scenarios where you may do it. Could be your soil temperatures are creeping way up before your grass is breaking dormancy, so you're trying to hit that fairy ring timing at 55 degrees. Or you're trying to control some of those superficial diseases, which can discolor Bermuda grass when it's dormant. So some of those applications, but overall, I would focus your applications more when the plants are actually growing.
Jesse, if I can I tag on to
Yep.
his question and ask, does the harshness of the winter affect the severity of a disease like spring dead spot? And would the inherent genetic ability of Bermuda grass to tolerate winter injury help reduce susceptibility to a disease like spring dead spot?
Yeah, and you mentioned that spring dead spot, having conversations with Dr. Wendell Hutchins, who's now the turf pathologist at Arkansas, and we've discussed at length that spring dead spot really is that stress disease. And when you tend to see the most spring dead spot is when you have that harsh winter. So anything you can do to improve the plant health of that plant heading into winter, better results you're likely to have during spring green up.
And Wendell did just quite a bit of work on winter kill study and research, so he is deep into that area now as well. You guys pack a lot into an hour. Dr. James Hempfling, Dr. Jesse Benelli. We don't have any other questions in the queue. Is there anything else either of you want to bring up before the end of the webinar?
Well, I'm always up for thanking the audience, expressing my gratitude one last time, and to GCI for hosting us.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Really appreciate this opportunity. This is our contact information. This is our real phone numbers. Okay, when you call it, there's no automated answering machine. Please reach out with any comments or questions to continue this very important conversation.
Well, thank you to both of you. Thank you to everybody for attending. This is the end of the webinar. If anybody wants to review the webinar, it will be available here in the coming days in a recorded format.